Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another exciting Center for Education and Neuroscience seminar. And today it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rebecca Gordon. Dr. Rebecca Gordon is an associate professor of cognitive psychology in the Department of Psychology and Human Development at UCL Institute of Education. She is also a chartered member and associate fellow of the British Psychological Society and director of the Motor Executive Cognitive Interaction Research Group. Her research focus is on working memory and executive function as it relates to academic outcomes such as readings and maths. She also investigates the relationships between executive functions and dyslexia in children and adults. Rebecca will be talking to us about working memory as a current and future predictor of maths ability in primary school children, the effect of time constraints, working memory domain, and performance indices. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll get back to them after the talk. So I will hand over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Yasin. Can you all hear me okay? Can somebody say yes out loud? Because I can't.
Yes.
Thank you. Right, because I've now taken the video off. I can't see you. Okay, hello and welcome to my talk on working memory and maths ability in primary school children. I hope that you'll be generous. I'm actually a bit of a stand-in. This is a talk that I did want to give, but later in the year, once I'd done a bit more analysis, but that we had somebody quite understandably was unable to present this week, so I said I would present early. But I still have a story to tell. It's just the analysis is not as detailed as it could be. So I hope you'll be generous. Thank you. That's the word. Right. So this is some research that I have done with my colleagues at LSBU and also at City University London. So Jamie Smith-Clark, Liz Newton and Lucy.
Right.
Oh, somebody has got their mic on, just so you know. You can turn your mic off. Right, so just in case nobody knows what working memory is, I'm going to very briefly describe it in very simple terms. So it's the concurrent processing and, I've spotted a typo, and maintenance of information for short periods of time in pursuit of a known goal. And it's used all the time. You're using it now while you're processing what I'm saying, but maintaining it in memory while you listen to the rest of what I'm saying so that everything I say hopefully makes sense. We use it all the time, you know, mental shopping lists, mental maths, that sort of thing. So sometimes it's separated into verbal and visual spatial working memory, so two separate stores, and sometimes it's even further separated into visual and spatial memory. And I think Katie Allen is here. So hello, Katie. And I'm sorry about the typo of the year you did your study. It wasn't 20119. It was 2019, I believe. So in this study, as well as others, what was looked at was spatial simultaneous and spatial sequential working memory. So this is the presentation of the stimuli and the tasks. So you might need to remember a series of spatial locations, and they could be presented one after another. I don't know whether you can see me, but I'm doing dots in the air, or the spatial array could be shown all in one hit, and then you have to remember the spatial array. So early to mid primary school years are a very important time for the development of working memory. There are very marked increases in capacity, both in terms of how much information can be remembered, but also how long it can be remembered for throughout primary school. Visual spatial working memory in particular, and this becomes important later, and that capacity doubles. There's research to show it doubles between the ages of 5 to 10 years. So quite rapid development there. Verbal working memory. So in terms of verbal rehearsal, so when you're trying to remember information in working memory, you might do subvocal or vocal rehearsal where you repeat say the items on a shopping list or the phone number that you're trying to remember while you do something else. That sort of emerges around 7 to 8 years of age, so mid-primary. But the basic structure of working memory is evident from about six years of age. As I talk through this, I'm noticing all my typos. I'm sorry, it's because I didn't have time to refine my slides. However, adult levels of working memory aren't reached, there is research to show, until about 15 years of age. So it does continue to develop. There are some challenges when you do research into working memory. One of them is that there are many different models that aim to explain what working memory is. So there are some attention-based models which place a lot of importance on the activation of information from long-term memory when it's needed in a working memory situation, and then the focus of attention on that information for as long as you need it. So less about processing, more about maintaining information as active while it's required. And these models don't tend to look at different verbal and visual spatial, it's just like items of information in working memory. And then there's the multi-component model, which is probably one of the most famous. It's definitely the one that has been around for longest and probably has the most solid empirical base, purely because of the length of time. I'm not saying it's a more robust model. So that's the Baddeley and Hitch model, 1974. And that looks at the integrated role of processing and storage information and does separate between verbal stores and visual spatial stores of information. There is, and this is relevant later, there are no actual models. There is research, but there are no models that actually separate verbal and visual spatial processing as opposed to storage of information. So in working memory, if you're measuring it, there's always usually there's always a processing element of the task, and you'll see that when we talk through some of the experiments here today. And there's also no model that separates visual and spatial abilities generally, so not specifically processing storage, but just abilities. Again, there is research, and there's this case study that I note here, but there's no models that actually explain that, like the visual spatial processing or visual and spatial abilities. And the reason I make this point is that there is still more to research in working memory in terms of not just the models themselves, but how they explain academic outcomes in children, because we know that working memory is very important in children's learning. So another challenge is the different tasks that are used, the different indices that are used to measure working memory ability or capacity, and then also the different domains that I talked a little bit about on the previous slide. So there's, like I said, there's a lot of evidence for the role of working memory in educational outcomes in children, and ever such a lot for maths ability. So this has really grown in the last 20 years. Usually capacity is used as the performance indices for task measuring working memory, so the amount of information that can be retained. But there are studies that have looked at processing speed, which working memory tasks indirectly measure this anyway, but it's not normally used as an indices. And Baylis have done work on this, but also I have, and I'm going to get to that later on. There is research, including mine, but also I think that's not Levine, that's Lepine, sorry, and St. Clair Thompson. That last study is actually with adults, the other two are with children. I think the Lepines is, sorry. That strategy is less important. So what I mean by this is that when you measure working memory tasks in children and look at how they predict academic outcomes like maths, if you design the task such as the amount of time that participants have between the processing and storage elements is reduced, so they have much less opportunity to verbally rehearse and keep active the information in working memory. If you restrict that time, so people are less likely to be using strategies like that, the link with academic outcomes like maths is stronger. So what this suggests is that the strategy use in working memory, even though it might help children and adults maintain information for longer periods of time, it doesn't mean that indicates that is actually what is important in academic outcomes. And this suggests that it's more likely to be this really fundamental capacity to focus attention or keep active information without any other help. And there's also arguments that strategy use creates noise in the measure because some children have better verbal abilities than others, so they might be better able to verbally rehearse, or other cognitive factors might come into play in terms of the development of a strategy to maintain information. So it makes the measure a bit more messy. That's the interpretation anyway. And there's very varied research in terms of when visuospatial working memory is important and when verbal abilities are important. So there has been research to show that younger children rely on visuospatial abilities, whereas older children later rely on verbal abilities, maybe because they're retrieving maths facts from long-term memory and trying to keep that information active by maintaining it in working memory. But the reverse has already been found, and we've done a meta-analysis on this that was published last year, and I'm going to very briefly talk about that before we get to the main study in this presentation. Right, so that is so I'm going to give you a brief sort of whistle-stop tour through 4 previous studies that speak to the study that I'm going to talk about today. The study I'm talking about today is not yet published. I'm still writing it up. So back in 2020, we looked at working memory and high-level cognition in children. We looked at nonverbal reasoning, reading, and maths, but I'm going to just take the maths element out when I talk about this study today, because that's obviously the component that's relevant. And I'll talk about that in a moment. And then in 2021, we did a study where we looked at the different components of working memory. So we separated out verbal and visual spatial processing and storage and the central executive, etc., and looked at how they explain different maths topics. And then we also had another study that year which looked at, so we cut up verbal, visual, and spatial processing and storage. So we dissected working memory even more to look at how it explains. We actually looked at verbal comprehension, reading, counting, and maths, but for this, I'm just going to focus on the counting and maths. And then there's the meta-analysis that I talked about before. So very briefly, the Gordon et al. Study in 2020, we wanted to understand how time restrictions affect performance in working memory in 7 to 8-year-olds. So this is at a time when verbal rehearsal is sort of beginning to stabilize, or is more prevalent in that age group. And as I said, previous studies have looked at what the effect time restrictions have, but they had a blanket time restriction for every single participant. So they restricted the presentation time of the stimuli, so for 750 milliseconds or whatever. But what we did was we titrated the presentation of the processing stimuli for the children. So we measured their processing speed first, and then we used that as the amount of time we presented stimuli within the working memory task. The idea being that they would have enough time to process the stimuli, but very little extra time to actually verbally rehearse to maintain the information they should be maintaining. This will make more sense when I get to the next slide. And we also wanted to understand how doing that compared to a condition where there was no restriction on processing time, how does that affect the relationship with maths? And we broke up the indices. So like I said, normally people will look at storage capacity. So how much information can you store in working memory? That's your working memory capacity. And we look at that measure in terms of how it relates to, for example, your maths performance. But we looked at storage accuracy, but we also looked at the amount of time it took for the children to recall the information from working memory. And this has been looked at previously and been found to be important in a study by John Towers and Nelson Cowan. We also wanted to look at how accurate the children were at processing the stimuli and how that related to maths, and then also the speed with which they processed the information. So this is what we did, and I have presented this about 3 years ago to the CEM before, so I'm going to give a very, very brief just recap in case people have seen it. But also it's not the main point of this talk. So we used a counting span task and a listening span task and an odd one out span task. So the counting span, obviously it measures verbal working memory because you count the dots 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then you have to remember there were 7 dots on that slide you count 1, 2, 3, 4, you have to remember there were 4 dots on that slide. You count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and remember there were 6 dots on that slide. And then you have to recall 7, 4, 6. So it's verbal, but obviously it's also numeric. So we use this because it's a very common measure used. But so we wanted to, when we're thinking about previous research, we wanted to understand what counting span looks like in terms of relating to mathematics when we actually apply the manipulations that we were going to apply. And then we had a listening span task, so a non-numeric verbal working memory task, which was you hear a sentence like apples have noses, and you decide whether it makes sense or not, and then you remember the last word. And so you hear a series of sentences, and for this, the number of last words that you can remember in the right order is your listening span capacity. For counting span, it's obviously number of dots per slide in the right order, counting span. And then we had an odd one out span task, which was supposed to be purely nonverbal. So you look at 3 shapes and you point to the one that is the odd one out, and then you remember its location. So this is a visual spatial working memory task. But what we did first was we gave all children 20 non-memory trials. So 20 trials where they did not have to remember anything, just so we could calculate their mean processing time. And then we used that as the amount of time we processed the stimuli in the actual working memory task, which was still counting, listening, and odd one out, but obviously with different stimuli. So just cutting straight to the regression for that. So what we were interested in was how the 2 versions of the task, so whether it was experimenter-led, so this is purely looking at storage, the experimenter-led, which is where sorry, not the experimenter, so ignore that. So the task where there was no time restrictions compared to the task where there were time constrictions. And what we did was to look to see whether either task explained variance when controlling for the variance explained in the other task. So in this first line, you can see here that the unrestricted task did explain variance in maths, and the computer-paced task, so the one where the time was restricted, also explained variance in maths, even when controlling for the variance explained by the unrestricted task. Sorry, I just saw a message. And then we did the same in reverse. So as you can see here for counting, the restricted task explained variance in maths, but then the unrestricted task also explained variance in maths, even when controlling for the other task. And it was a slightly different story for the listening span task. The unrestricted task didn't explain any variance in maths, only the restricted task, and the restricted task did, even when controlling for its counterpart. And then for the visual spatial task, same story, only the computer-based version, and even when controlling for the unrestricted task, the task that was not time restricted. So where are we next? Yes. So then we wanted to look at the individual performance indices. So as I said, we looked at storage accuracy, recall time, processing accuracy, and processing time. And we did the same. So what we did here was that we looked at the storage, because that's the one typically used at step 1, and we controlled for all that variance. And then at step 2, looked to see what additional variance could be explained by the remaining indices: processing time, recall time, and processing accuracy. Excuse me. And we did this for both versions of the task, restricted and unrestricted. And so what you see here is that for the counting span task, in the unrestricted condition, it was only storage that explained variance in maths. But in the time restricted condition, even when controlling for storage, processing time explained performance in maths. For listening span, for the listening span task, it was only the computer pace, the one where there was restricted time. That was the only one that explained variance in maths, and it was only storage, nothing from the other indices. But for visual spatial task, OB1 outspan task, it was only in the condition that was time restricted. And after controlling for storage, once again, processing time did explain variance in mathematics. So that's just a briefly covered what we did in that study in 2020. But then in 2021, this is me. This isn't the same set of researchers. This is me with some of my master's students, and I thank them. We wanted to look at the developmental trajectory. So it's cross-sectional, but look at across different age groups, how different components of working memory relate to maths ability. So we measured verbal short-term storage, visual spatial short-term storage, processing speed, and the central executive. And the reason we did this was because the design of the previous task very much wanted to look at processing time and storage, etc., in a working memory task. So when there was an executive load or a conflict between processing and storage. But what we did here was we took what might be noise, might not be noise, but we removed that and separately measured verbal short-term storage, visual spatial short-term storage, processing speed, not broken by verbal or visual spatial, but just processing speed, and the central executive, which we think we were measuring the central executive. It's a difficult thing to measure without measuring the other stuff, but anyway. And we looked at 3 age groups, 7 to 8-year-olds, 9 to 10-year-olds, and 14 to 15-year-olds, remembering that working memory can continue to develop until 15. And this is very much a summary of the findings, otherwise we'll be here all day. But what's important about this is what you see is in the 7 to 8-year-olds, there's kind of a general use of those different components that make up working memory. And they explain sort of specific areas of maths, because we didn't just measure maths as one single outcome. We looked at the different components of maths that make up the curriculum in the UK. So we've got using and applying maths, counting, understanding number facts, algebra, etc. But what you see here is all components of what we are saying are components of working memory, explaining maths ability across topics that children are typically exposed to in those younger years that aren't as complicated as maybe things like I'm trying to think of something that's a bit more there's shape in there, or I think they're all in there, but yes, so there's kind of this general reliance on working memory. But as you move through to 9 to 10-year-olds and 14 to 15-year-olds, the storage in the verbal storage and the visual spatial storage no longer explain maths ability once you take into account the other measures, central executive. So it's more about the central executive and processing speed. And especially you get to the older age group, they explained the total math score. So all of those abilities together rather than independent subcomponents such as calculation and number facts, etc., which you saw more of in the 9 to 10-year-olds. The other thing is, just to note here, because it does become a little bit more relevant later, is that we looked at the verbal or ability of verbal storage, visual spatial, central executive, and processing speed across the age groups. And there was no significant difference in verbal ability across these age groups, which is pretty in line with all the research that looks at the developmental trajectory of verbal short-term storage. But visual spatial, there was significant gains in visual spatial ability from across the 3 age groups and the central executive and processing speed. Right, so now on to briefly the third study. So here we wanted to look at the contributions of verbal, visual, and spatial storage and processing. So breaking them all up and using storage as an indices and processing as indices. So again, this is unpacking a working memory task. Like the last study, it's not actually a working memory task, it's the components thereof. And we wanted to look at maths and counting. So we wanted to look at basic understanding of number and then the more complex maths on top of that. So our questions were, what are the roles of verbal, visual, spatial, visual and spatial storage and processing for maths ability, for counting ability? And is there a difference in those relationships for that foundational skill compared to the downstream skill? So we measured their storage with a verbal forward digit, a visual sequential memory. So this is remembering the order of abstract shapes. And then the spatial was forward block recall, forward Corsi span. For processing, it was just the matter of copying a word. So the researcher would say day or night in random order. So day, day, night, night, day, day. So it's just the child's ability to process what was being said and copying that, demonstrating they had processed it by copying it. For visual processing, it was the ability to identify the odd one out of 3 shapes. So if you remember the previous odd one out span task, it was just the speed with which they could pick which one was the odd one out. So it's visual processing. Spatial was the speed to connect a series of numbered dots. So they had to search for the different dots which were numbered on a sheet and then connect them all. So it's like it is mixed up with visual, obviously, very, very difficult to not do so. But it's but it was like the spatial array. So taking in the spatial array of the dots and connecting them. And somebody's asked a question, which I might quickly answer. Were there different sets of mathematical tests for the 3 age groups? That's a very, very good question. The earlier 2, so we use the Access Maths test. So it's a standardized test which maps to the UK curriculum. The younger 2 age groups, we used the test that was appropriate for them, which was the same test. But for the older age group, it was the second, it was Access Maths 2, which is for the older age group. So that we aren't quite comparing like for like, even though it is still a standardized test that maps to the UK curriculum by the same people. It was different tests. So thank you for that. Right, so then we looked, counting dots was the way we measured counting. And then for this, we just had school grade. We had different schools taking part, and it was just with different curriculums. It was difficult to get a measure that we could rely on. So we thought we'll look at school grade, which has been shown to be quite reliable as an indicator of children's ability, much less so than using school grade for literacy. That tends to be a bit more wobbly. Okay, so what did we find? So I've just pulled out the key findings. So only visual storage and processing predicted counting. Nothing didn't predict anything else. Nothing else predicted it, sorry. And this supports some work by Alan et al. And like I said, I think Katie's here. And maybe this suggests that the conversion to symbolic numbers from objects requires visual representation. We wouldn't know without further research, but it is something, you know, it's definitely something worth looking at. Only verbal and spatial storage predicted maths. So again, we've got the spatial storage here and the visual storage, which we wouldn't have been able to measure if we hadn't broken up visual and spatial storage. Maybe this suggests that cognitive mechanisms differentiate according to the different task demands, you know, maths compared to counting. Possible, but worth further investigation. But that's certainly in line with the changing in the relationships when we change task demands. So like by restricting time, but that would require further investigation. But the 4th study that builds to this study that I want to talk about is this meta-analysis that was done late last year. So what we wanted to look at, again, this was a master's student. She did a brilliant job. And we wanted to look at the roles of factors that have been explored previously in research, so domains, verbal or visual spatial, or visual or spatial, the age of the child. So we looked at children from 6 to 12 years of age. So we wanted to look at the primary school years, but the papers that we got sort of went into the 12 years age. So we brought those in as well. Otherwise it was just too tricky to get enough for the final year of primary school. And then we also looked at operation type, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, because this is something that was commonly examined in the papers that we looked at in the meta-analysis. So we just looked at the papers that studied arithmetic, and they tended to be divided up into these 4 operation types. And then we also wanted to understand the different demands by whether the task was mental or written, because obviously they would have different working memory demands. So we, in the end, we got over 11,000 participants, 55 independent samples, 46 studies, 187 effect sizes. The overall correlation between working memory and arithmetic was significant, but what we wanted to look at was the moderation effects of the working memory domain, the age of the child, the type of operation, and the task type. I'm just going to pause to look at another. What is school grade? So that's the year of primary school that the children are in. Oh, no, you mean school grade. So that's the maths grade that the children are given. So it's their maths ability marker at the end of a school year, if that's what you mean. Right. So yes, we wanted to look at moderation effects. So the moderation, there were moderation effects for verbal working memory, visual spatial. There was also one for composite, but it wasn't included in subsequent regression analysis because there are only 7 correlations, so it wasn't really worth looking at. But there was a moderation effect of verbal, whether the working memory was a verbal working memory task or a visual spatial task. So that did make a difference. And there was a significant difference between the correlations for verbal working memory and arithmetic and visual working memory, in that verbal working memory had a stronger association with arithmetic, but we'll get to that. So in the meta-regression, just so you know, we control for all the other factors, so age, operation, and arithmetic in this case. So moderation effects so there was significant, oh yes, so we looked also, because some studies did use different visual spatial tasks, so I explained the difference between sequential and simultaneous earlier. So there were significant correlations with arithmetic for those 2 subdomains, but there was no difference between those correlations. So it doesn't necessarily mean that, well, it wasn't moderating. Subsequent analysis, so there was no visual working memory included because there were no tasks that specifically measured that in the data set. Moderation effects of age. So there was no significant effect of age on the overall working memory relationship, but there was an effect of age on the specific working memory domains. So this is the important bit. Verbal working memory declined with age. So even though it was more important, the relationship, so it had a stronger relationship, the relationship was less important as children moved through to 12 years of age, whereas the visual spatial relationship remained stable throughout the whole age group. And there was no significant effect of age on the subdomain task type, so we didn't look at that. Moderation effects for operation type, they were all significant. But there were no differences between, there weren't significant difference in those relationships. Yes, and the effects for each was very small, so we don't know how robust these are anyway. Significant correlations with each working memory domain, so mental, arithmetic, and verbal, and visual spatial, etc. They were all significant, but there was no significant difference in the correlations between task type and domain. So the main interpretation, before I promise I will eventually get to the study in this, the main interpretation is that verbal working memory, possibly from this meta-analysis, it suggests that it has an important supportive influence initially, so particularly for addition and subtraction, but this then fades, whereas visual spatial working memory retains supportive influence throughout. So it suggests that maybe verbal mediation of operations matters to kind of launch the understanding of maths. So they're maintaining this information in verbal working memory, but that non-verbal manipulation, so visual spatial skills, are more fundamental. But we can look at that interpretation later. But we have seen similar patterns in science learning for this, where if you remove the need for language in explaining something, so when you get children to use language to explain their understanding, there's a lot of difference, a lot of individual variation in understanding. But if you allow them to explain something in a non-verbal way, such as pretending to be the object that they're just talking about, mass or weight or something, then the ability levels reduce significantly. So there is evidence that non-verbal abilities are very important in understanding concepts that you see in science and maths. So summary of all those findings, we know that processing speed within the working memory task is important, and processing speed generally. Verbal and visual spatial storage are important early on, but processing speed, it would seem, and the central executive are important as children go older. Though our central executive task may have just been measuring processing speed when you consider our other findings. And that, as I just said, verbal working memory has an important supportive influence initially, but visual spatial is more constant to the year until the age of 12 in our analysis anyway. Right, so I am now finally at the current study. So what we did was the children who were in the study in 2020, that was published in 2020, the data, we followed them up 2 years after the data was first collected. So we had all their working memory measures, and we used and their maths ability. And so we used those measures that were taken when they were 7 and 8 years of age to see what the relationship was with their maths ability 2 years later when they were 9 to 10 years of age. And so we use, so what, just to recap, we had a visual spatial, a numeric verbal, which we'll now call numeric, and a non-numeric verbal, which we'll now call verbal. So that's the odd one out span, the counting span, and the listening span. And we used the indices of storage and processing because those are the ones that consistently have been shown to predict the ability in these age groups. And then we had the 2 different conditions, obviously, because this is the 2020 study. So we could compare time restrictions to no restrictions to look at the long-term role of that in working memory. So, yes, so I've said this basically. We had all working memory tasks at time 1 when they were 7 to 8, and then we had their maths grade at time 1 and their maths grade at time 2 when they were 9 to 10 years of age. So first of all, just quickly look at the correlations. All the measures correlated with maths at time 1 and time 2. Well, we already knew this for time 1, even though I didn't show it earlier. I went straight for regression, but we know that they all correlated with maths grade. And they also all, except for verbal working memory processing speed, processing time, all correlated with maths at time 2, so maths 2 years later. But let's have a look at the regression. So this is at time 1, and again, we already know this, but I've summarized it here. So storage was a significant predictor of maths when we were looking at current maths ability at 7 to 8, and also processing. And at time 2, so that measure of working memory storage and processing at time 1, both of those were significant predictors of maths at time 2, so storage and processing again. And then if we look at, so sorry, I have to remind me, like I said, this is a new study. So yeah, okay, so those are the ANOVAs and the variance explained. So that's adjusted R squared, by the way, just so you know. So let's look at the coefficients. So in time 1, it was only verbal working memory storage that held a significant relationship with maths ability. But at time 2 is verbal storage and visual spatial storage. When it comes to processing speed, at time 1, it was only numeric working memory that held a relationship with maths ability. But at time 2, numeric processing and visual spatial processing. So what we're seeing here is this importance of visual spatial ability at time 2 coming in. So as if you remember from the previous study, the meta-analysis, I was saying that verbal ability had a stronger relationship. But if you look across age groups, visual spatial is more constant. And I think that's what we're seeing here. But this is early analysis. I haven't done lots of, hierarchical stuff yet. I've got yet to do that, but I am presenting this earlier than I thought. So just to summarize the findings, so the time restriction condition, yes, so sorry, that's the other thing I didn't say. If you look at these, it's always the time restricted condition. That's what R means, means restriction. So it's always the time restricted condition that predicted maths ability when you're not doing any controlling for the other factors, etc. So time restricted was the better predictor. So this speaks back to what we were saying about if you reduce the opportunity for it might not be reducing the opportunity for strategy. It might be reducing the opportunity for distraction. We don't know unless we do strategy interviews or other tasks, etc. But yes, verbal storage at time 1, but additional variance explained by visual spatial storage at time 2, and then the same for processing. Just the numeric, I think it was numeric, wasn't it? Yes. Numeric, which is kind of a verbal measure, but yeah, it does have a numeric component at time 1, and then additional visual spatial processing at time 2. So what does this tell us? Well, it does tell us that the working memory maths relationship changes with age, and we kind of known that from our studies, but also other people's research. It also suggests that maintenance strategies might not play an important role in this relationship, might not. That there is a current relationship possibly on verbal ability in mid and also younger, if you think of the meta-analysis, earlier primary school. But the visual spatial abilities become apparent in older children, but longitudinal research like this one, but also I get to the next slide by other people, has shown similar things. So what this might indicate that there's gains in visual spatial storage and speed of processing during primary school that explain differences in maths learning. So if you think about the developmental trajectory I was saying about visual spatial abilities double in a certain, and I can't remember the age range now, but in one component of during the primary school years. And also when we looked at the developmental trajectory of our sample in the cross-sectional study, you saw that visual spatial had developmental gains, but verbal didn't. So it could indicate that it's that the gains which children acquire in visual spatial abilities are what carry them through maths learning throughout primary school. But there's a but coming. So it does support previous findings, the 2021 paper and the 22 paper. It does support other findings, this idea of visual spatial abilities predicting maths abilities in the future. So 2 years later, so our very own IRWAS has done research in 6-year-olds, and that was a neuroscience paper. But there are these other ones that looked at this similar. So IRWAS's paper was 6 to 16, but then this Fenari paper, first 3 years of primary, this very well-known paper, two of these by Geary have shown that gains in visual spatial abilities longitudinally will predict future maths. So it is supported by other research. We do need to consider how this applies to different maths concepts. We only did that in one study, and it was limited in terms of the amount of questions that we have for each mathematical subcomponent. And also it'd be worth considering what this looks like in different cultures and different languages, the different ways in which maths are taught, whether manipulatives are used, whether the different concepts, for example, in the States, they're taught very separately, whereas we have maths lessons. They have algebra and geometry, etc. And then obviously languages that where counting is very different in terms of where verbal rehearsal and maintenance might actually manifest in different ways in children. The other thing is that, earlier on I said about how there's research, ours and others, that shows that if you restrict opportunity for rehearsal, there's a stronger relationship with maths. And if you think about visual spatial tasks, it's very difficult, especially for children, to actually come up with a strategy that would help them maintain it. I mean, children spontaneously develop this verbal rehearsal, and they know it can help them remember stuff. But it's very difficult to do so in visual spatial tasks. So it is possible that the visual spatial ability, at least in the research that I've done, the stronger relationships are maybe not because they're visual spatial tasks, but because children find it more difficult to develop strategies to what they think might help them maintain information in working memory. Quite often it's not helping, it's a distractor, but it could be that rather than the visual spatial nature of the task. So that is actually it. I didn't do too bad. I thought I might run over. So yes, thank you everybody for listening, and I'm happy to take questions. I'll stop sharing my screen, but I can go back to it if I need to.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for this fascinating talk. Very interesting results. And actually, based on these interesting results, I would like to, start with a question of mine, and maybe we can go with the other questions that will come up from the chat. So my question is, why do you think that working memory maintenance strategies such as subvocal rehearsal are not important in the relationship between maths and working memory?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. It's like I was saying, it's is it because children do try and use strategies, especially when you're looking at the early to mid-primary years. They try to use strategies, but they're not necessarily helpful, and they increase cognitive load. They create distractions, so it creates noise in the task. But it's not like when we reduced the opportunity for strategy use, that's what we hoped we were doing when we restricted the time on the task, the children did not have a lower storage score. So they retained just as much in working memory. So, when you looked at the sample as a whole, there wasn't a significant difference in the mean storage. But I think that there was noise in there in terms of which children gained benefit and which children were impaired by trying to use strategies. And I think that's what kind of messes up the link with mathematics, whereas if you reduce that opportunity, it's not necessarily, there's not so much noise. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. We actually have another question from Liesl McConchy. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. So the question is, what are one or two takeaways from this research you think primary maths teachers should understand? How would you communicate that to a teacher in language that they would understand?
Absolutely excellent question. And that's what is so important, isn't it? And I believe Michael Thomas in a few weeks is giving a talk on just this. If I was sort of put on the spot now, which I am being to say what's important, I would say that just to be aware that verbal abilities and visual spatial abilities are probably just as important in terms of understanding, and that just because children can't verbalize what they understand doesn't mean they don't understand it, because the visual spatial abilities demonstrate that there is a link there. And also that it's not just about how much information they can store, because sometimes if children have problems remembering information for a short period of time, they're given external memory aids like a mini whiteboard or something, or a number line or something, which makes perfect sense. But sometimes it could be that that's not the problem. It's the speed with which they can process that information and then apply it to the task at hand. So thinking about that, it would depend on the task itself, but allowing longer periods of time between different components of tasks. But this is something that there's another step from the research I'm doing to what it looks like in the classroom, and that's when you start to use this information for interventions to see what helps children with maths understanding. I hope that helps.
We currently do not have more questions, but if you have a question, please, you can also use the raise your hand option, and you can just turn your camera or mic on to talk, or you can just put them in the chat. While another question might come up, I have another question, if you don't mind me. So maybe we can get some details about the assessment tools that you used for example, visuospatial storage. What types of tools that were used?
So the majority of tasks were pretty standard. So, counting span, listening span, odd one out span. But when we wanted to break up the visual storage, the spatial storage, the visual processing, the spatial processing, we had to be a little bit more inventive, because there either weren't tasks out there, or the tasks that were out there were kind of conflating the two. So that's why we had like the pattern span task, where children just had to remember the sequence of abstract patterns. So the patterns were so abstract that we hope the aim was that the children couldn't verbally recode and name them, so that they couldn't maintain them. They had to actually memorize the visual array. So, and some of those we had to be quite inventive. And the visual processing stuff, the spatial processing tasks, sorry, where they're joining up the dots that have different numbers. I'm not 100% convinced that that measures just spatial processing, but it is difficult to find one that doesn't have a visual element. But it certainly held different relationships, so that was good. I think we've got a hand up, Georgina.
Yes, Georgina, please.
Hi, I hope it's not too loud. If it is, I'll type it. So I'm just out in a common area. But I was wondering, within your sample, did you have children of like very varied ability? So, like, did you have children who were sort of excelling for their group and children who really struggled? Because I've been working with children who are really struggling, and so it'd be interesting to know whether that sort of translates to children who are struggling.
We did have a good distribution of ability, so they were children who were less, performed less well in maths, and we had also, in the original study, had also measured reading and non-verbal reasoning, and those that were very top of their class. But we did there were 2 children with dyslexia, because at the time we were, like I said, we were measuring reading, and a lot of the tasks required reading. So we did exclude children that actually had identified special educational needs and disabilities specific to the tasks we were using and to the outcome measures we were using. So yeah, a good array of abilities, but no special educational needs children, because that wasn't the focus of the study, but it is something that I would like to look at.
Thank you, Rebecca. Let's see if we have more questions in the chat. We currently do not have more. So I actually have just another one. I keep asking questions because I'm very interested in the research. The previous question that Georgina asked was really interesting, actually. And I wonder, I mean, if the case study that you did in the end, if it was administered in between, let's say, dyslexic children, would the results provide different, or when we compare to typically developing children, dyslexic children?
You mean if I were to do the study and the look at the relationship between working memory and maths in children with dyslexia, is that
Yes.
Okay. So, well, there's a few things to yes, for a couple of reasons. The results would be different. One is that the comorbidity of dyslexia with dyscalculia is very high, much higher than it is for other atypicalities. So there would obviously, it would be very difficult to tease that out. But let's say we could just get children who were dyslexic but not dyscalculic. Children and adults with dyslexia have very different attentional profiles, cognitive profiles. So they do perform less well in working memory tasks, whether they're visual, spatial, or verbal. They perform less well in they tend to have more executive failures, which is not a very nice term, but the ability to sustain your attention in a novel situation is more reduced in people with dyslexia. So I think you would see different relationships, which is important to note.
Thank you. We have a question from Mahitab. So she says, I wonder if motivational factors such as self-perceived ability, for example, play a role here as well, and whether it should be looked beside working memory performance.
Yeah, there's going to be so many other factors at play, what life is like at home, the child's own motivation, as you say, and a number of different things. So when you look at something like working memory and maths, you are looking very much at one factor that could explain maths ability and what you could do about that should a child have deficits in working memory. But there are all sorts of things that can cause working memory impairment as well. Maths anxiety, general anxiety, again, socioeconomic factors, things that are going on at home. So motivation is definitely important. It's not I'm aware of it, but it's not an area that I research. But I think so. I do have a PhD student at the moment. I don't know if she's here actually. I didn't look. Who's looking at maths anxiety, working memory, and maths performance. But it's a longitudinal study, so it starts off with young children where you wouldn't actually say, you know, do you have maths anxiety? You know, because they're like 5 or 6 years of age. But you can ask them how they feel about maths. You can even get them to use an array of smiley faces to frowny faces to say how they feel about it. And I think that that's very important to study, to take into account how they actually, what their attitude to maths is in the first place, because that interacts with working memory, but it also will interact with their performance on the tasks themselves, of course, in terms of how motivated they are to do them. So thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting questions are coming up, actually, Rebecca. So Katie asks, I'm intrigued by the idea of separating processing from central executive abilities. Do you think we can truly get at these things separately, or do you use the terms almost interchangeably across different studies? She also adds that that's quite working memory heavy rather than maths.
It's a really important point, and I'm glad you asked a question, Katie. I was hoping you would. So this is really a can of worms. So it's very, very, very difficult to isolate the central executive, but we wanted to do so. Hey, put a camera on. We wanted to do so because we were measuring storage, so which was just like forward span tasks, simple span tasks. So we did use a digit span backwards just so we could measure in some way that manipulation. And because it had been done in other studies, it wasn't like, oh, you've done it, so therefore it's a thing, but it's so we could compare our findings with other studies that had used like a digit span backwards to measure verbal working memory. Well, what does that look like if we look at that and think about it purely as the central executive and then look at those other abilities as well? And we did see patterns of different relationships across the age group, which I thought was interesting. But the whole central executive working memory executive function is, yeah, it's kind of I'm actually writing a paper at the moment with Dana. I don't know if Dana is here. She was going to try and attend, from the States, Milicoto, to talk about just that, because the terms working memory, central executive, executive abilities, executive function are used interchangeably a lot in the literature. And you can have one task that claims to measure those, you know, in different papers claims to measure those things, or you can have one of those things, such as the central executive, with many, many different tasks used to measure it. And it creates a field that's difficult to navigate. And I think that needs to be recognized. So I'm glad you asked that question.
Thank you very much, Katie and Rebecca. So we are actually about to end our session. Thank you very much, everyone. If you have just one last question that we can have for the last minute, if not, we will be waiting for like 30 more seconds. And
Matt.
Yeah. Please.
Could I ask a question?
Kristen, we will get to your question after Matthew.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Make it quick, Matt.
Thanks, Rebecca. I was curious how you kind of interpret the finding that you have verbal non-numeric working memory and numeric working memory, but it's the non-numeric verbal working memory that kind of seems a stronger predictor of maths, which is kind of curious because it's maths and it involves numbers.
I know. And I haven't delved down into, I mean, in the 2020 study, I delved down into that in more detail, but didn't have time to present it, because when you control, and I haven't done the hierarchical regression for the current study, but when you control from other factors in various different ways, doing stepwise regression in different orders, it's really counting span, which is the strongest predictor of maths ability. And particularly if you use the task where there's time restrictions, and in particular, processing time. So there is something about counting, obviously, in a working memory task that predicts maths, and that makes perfect sense. But it's whether the variance explained is just by the counting. the speed with which children can count, rather than them processing verbal information. So because in the current study, I haven't yet done the hierarchical regression, and that's why I think you saw the direct relationship with non-numeric verbal working memory. But it's to be unpacked.
Right, yeah, no, it's really interesting. And do you think that it could be like that they both might be involved in different ways? Or because you talked about like understanding instructions and sort of reading and things like that as well. And
that I think that what we need to do next is look at the different, because maths isn't one thing. Maths is, multi-component, componential, the word flew out of my head. But it has many components and subtopics. So I think what we need to do is look at all those subcomponents with a larger example, with more test questions per component, and look at those different relationships with counting, with a verbal, a numeric verbal, a visual, a spatial task. But I think that would be big and would need a grant.
Thank you, Matthew. So we will take the last question. Christine, thank you for waiting. Please, it's your turn.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I notice there's an increasing interest in things like bilingualism, multilingualism, and the cultural aspects. I'm thinking perhaps, also Jodie Hunter's work and various others. And I think it's fascinating, because I was wondering, do you know how many children in your samples, when you've seen them, actually were bilingual speakers, or maybe more?
Yeah, several of them were. So these are South East London schools, and there are a lot of bilingual children in there. We didn't have any children that struggled with comprehending English. There weren't any in the classes. But
so you think that their level of understanding in English was much the same as the other children?
There was certainly no indication that they didn't understand what they needed to do. So there was no need to repeat what I said to explain in a different way, because these standardized tasks, we have scripts that we read to make sure it's consistent across all children, and there wasn't an issue with that. But yeah, there's a whole lot of research with varying findings about bilingualism and multilingualism, and how
I think also that the cultural aspects, like with Jodie Hunter's work in New Zealand, it's interesting how if they think maths is important or have a different view, how do they assess it? What sort of opinions about mathematics in their culture? And that's, I think, very important, isn't it? It's coming out.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, they're very different attitudes to maths in different cultures, and which is why on one of the slides I said that I think to look at this in different cultural settings, different ways the maths are taught, but also the different attitudes to maths, as you say.
Yes.
And how late children start to learn maths, because in like Nordic countries they start school later. So
okay, thank you.
Thank you very much all. I know you might have more questions, but we are out of time now. So thank you very much all for listening. And Rebecca, it was a great pleasure to chair the session. And thank you for your time. And thank you all for attending the session through the end, actually. And anything last thing that you would like to add, Rebecca?
I think everybody probably wants to go home.
Have a lovely day, and see you in the next CEN seminar.
Okay. Thanks for sharing, Yasin. Bye.
Thank you.